take a good look around the world today, that so many countries, particularly all the way from Asia and to the countries in Europe, are undergoing this tremendous political and also this social changes. Now, when we come to political discoupling, or we talk about social breakdown, one word that generally comes to our mind is the word called reconciliation. Now, of course, when we talk about political reconciliation, that generally speaking, that just means that parties are coming together and hoping to send better messages, not only to the audience domestically, but also to the constituents across the world. But meanwhile, today, it's rather difficult to understand the meaning of being harmonious and also living in the reconciliatory status when we come to the political changes. And for example, let's take a look at the country of Spain. And recently, this country is also undergoing this tremendous political and social changes. And how should we understand that the concept is truth will ever bring reconciliation, not only for the people, but also to the parties? Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, which is Mark Nayler. Now, Mark is a freelance journalist and based in Spain. Of course, if you know him, that he mainly covers political changes in Spain, and recently he came out with the article which is entitled, "In Spain, Can Truth Ever Bring Reconciliation?" Now, Mark, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. Mark, let's get right to the question. Again, when I discovered you, as we mentioned before, because this amazing article that you wrote, and which is entitled, "In Spain, Can Truth Ever Bring Reconciliation?" Now, let's dive into the article. Initially, you mentioned this concept called democratic memory law, which is a brand new type of system that got passed under the socialist prime minister. Now, for all of us that we aren't familiar with the current political status in Spain, how significant is this democratic memory law, and why is something that we need to pay attention today?
Well, the memory law that's recently been passed by Spain's socialist government is in fact an update of a very similar law passed in 2007, also by a socialist government. So it's not a brand new piece of legislation, but it is in some ways sort of has more meat to it than the 2000 version. The reason why both of those governments are trying to pass such laws is, and they've both been socialist governments, which is not coincidental. No right-wing government in Spain has yet to do anything like this. They're trying to sort of face up to a very troubling period of Spain's recent past, which was a civil war between 1936 and 1939, and a military fascist dictatorship that was in place from the end of the Civil War until 1975, when the dictator Francisco Franco died. The problem in Spain is that, unlike a lot of countries, say in South America, that have had military dictatorships, and that in some way, after the dictatorships had fallen, tried to sort of grapple with that period of their past, whether in the sense of identifying missing people or prosecuting people for war crimes, acts of both restorative and retributive justice. Nothing like this has ever happened in Spain until really the early 2000s, when the socialist government then started to try and pass democratic memory laws. So this is, if you like, a very belated attempt to do what a lot of countries did straight after the end of a dictatorship.
Now, again, Mark, I want to continue with this article. As you mentioned before, it says, this new memory law, and I quote, also mandates the teaching of the Civil War and dictatorship in school, which up till now have been marginalized as subjects. Now, help us to understand, because we know that for any part of the historical facts, especially for the younger generations today, it's crucial to understand what happened in the past, and so that will link to the impact to what's happening today. But right now, under this new memory law, it's mandating to teach in school and regarding the critical facts and also those historical evidence. share with us, why do you think it's so important to make it more mandatory, and what kind of message does the government send it to education or to the younger generations today?
Well, this is one respect, I think, in which the excuse me, the current memory law is actually an improvement on the 2007 version, because the 2007 version didn't go this far in terms of mandating education about civil war and dictatorship. One of the huge problems in Spain is that you have an entire generation of people around my age, and they're from sort of mid-20s to late 30s, who have no knowledge of that period of Spain's history, because it's not been taught in schools. And of course that sort of eats away at the social fabric of a country, because if no one's aware of what happened, then you can't begin to, as I say, grapple with it and deal with it, and, as it were, generally make it part of your living memory or understanding of the culture and country you live in. So I think this is very significant. I would add the caveat, though, that the details about how exactly the civil war and dictatorship will be taught have yet to be sort of made public, or I don't even know how detailed the law is in that respect. I suspect not very much, because a lot of it will depend on just what form that teaching takes, and whether it's pursued with sort of sufficient vigour by the educational authorities. But if it is, it will correct. It will sort of improve, possibly even solve, one of the biggest problems in Spain today with regards to historical memory. And that's, as I say, an entire generation with no formal education in terms of what happened in that period.
Mark, I want to ask you a very simple question. Again, this is also something you mentioned in the article, for Spain's transition from dictatorship to democracy. You know, today, when we talk about the concept of democracy, some people could argue it's such a vague concept, because, again, we've seen some of the countries are being torn because of the word democracy, and other countries are actually being shaped or being reformed because the concept of democracy. Now, help us to understand from your perspective. Again, you are the scholar and you are the journalist. How should we understand, even on behalf of the younger generations today, to understand what does that mean, have this transition from dictatorship to democracy, and what kind of steps, or, well, we say the tumultuous journeys that this country went through, and even today there's a law to make sure that people understand what happened in the past?
Well, that's a very complex question. In Spain's case, the transition to democracy depended to a large extent on a collective pact of forgetting. That's what it was. That's what it was called on the legal basis for the pact of forgetting. This was in the mid-70s, after Franco had died. And the legal basis of that pact of forgetting was actually a piece of legislation that was passed in Congress by both left and right-wing parties, called the Amnesty Act. It was passed in 1977. And the fundamental import of both the Pact of Forgetting and the Amnesty was that if Spain was to successfully transition from dictatorship to democracy, it had to leave the past untouched. The idea was that it would be more damaging if people were sort of raking over the coals of the past, whether in the form of prosecuting people or trying to identify disappeared people, that it was just too traumatic, that the past needed to be left firmly behind, untouched, if democracy was to flourish. And interestingly, a lot of people now, not just on the right, but mainly on the Spanish right, but there are even some figures on the Spanish left who say that was necessary at the time. That for democracy, for political scene consisting of lots of political parties, although in reality there were only two up until very recently, for that to have established itself, there did need to be an act of sort of collective amnesia almost. But that now decades later, that now the country is healthy enough and strong enough to sort of face up to its demons. But I mentioned in the article, and there is one interesting view on this, on how to deal with Spain's past, that sits between the left and right positions. And this has to do with democracy, which you asked about, is that Spain is now a very sort of vibrant, healthy democracy. There are now many more than two parties to vote from. Even in the US now, you still really just have those two parties to vote, to choose between. So the choice is very limited, and that's the same in the UK. Really, it's still fundamentally a battle between Labour and Conservatives, and up until 2015, that was the same in Spain. It was the socialists on the one hand, and it was the Conservatives on the other. Now we see a parliament in which an enormous array of political ideologies is represented. You have obviously the main two parties, but you have smaller parties on both on the left and right. You have pro-independence Catalan and Basque parties. So you could say that there's a lot to this view, that Spain is now fully functioning, healthy democracy, and that in itself is a refutation of the past and the dictatorship.
Mark, I want to continue with what you just said, and also that really brought up another interesting point is when we talk about democracy today, you use two countries. One is the US, another one is the United Kingdom. And we know that both countries today, because of the concept or the existence of democracy, the countries seem to be more divided than ever, only on the condition of economic freedom. Because again, when we look at this globalization, the system, everyone is paying attention to the very simple way is economy, economy, economy. So in other words, when we pursue the goal or when we reach the other side of the spectrum, which is the democracy linked to economic prosperity, or democracy should guarantee this common prosperity. Now, help us to understand, Mark, in Spain, when we understand the word democracy, as you mentioned before, on the you have the Socialist Party, you have the Conservative, and you have other multiple coexisting groups. But what about this economic concept, and what about this common prosperity? How is the system, the political system today, is guaranteeing or at least is ensuring this economic common prosperity in Spain?
Well, the economy, the economy in Spain is always one of the most important issues when people go to the polls in general elections. If you talk about economic prosperity in Spain, I mean, the country is not, the economy is not in the best shape at the moment. I mean, it's certainly one of Europe's most troubled countries in that respect. What governments can actually do about that, I think, is open to debate. Spain went without a government a few years ago. I think it almost beat Belgium for the longest days without a government. There was a deadlock in Parliament, and so that effectively the country had just a caretaking government for I think the best part of a year. I think for 9 months, and the economy sort of went along as normal. So I think that opens really interesting questions about economic stewardship and how much governmental control of an economy is either necessary or desirable. In terms of right now in Spain, the socialist government, have done a couple of good things economically. For example, they've made a huge reform to the labour market. The job market in Spain is a really big problem. Huge unemployment rates, both amongst adults and the 15 to 25-year-olds. And a big part of that problem is reliance on temporary contracts. Spain is a tourism superpower. So what that means is a lot of people only have jobs for the summer, for peak seasons. And of course, this is a problem for the labour market. So what the socialist government did is really reduced the number of temporary contracts flying around. So now many more people are on permanent contracts. So that contributes to stability to the labour market, which will take some time to be reflected in the macro stats. But it's a good start. Of course, Spain, like many southern European countries, was very hard hit by the pandemic as well, especially by one of the world's strictest lockdowns. That's obviously a slightly different topic. But it's, you know, Spain is economically very fragile. And that's always been the case. That's been the case ever since it became a democracy in the 70s. That's due to a number of factors, obviously, but it's certainly a big challenge for any incoming Spanish government is to improve the economy and get Spain really what they want. What Spanish governments want is to get Spain up into the major league of European players, you know, like Germany and France. But there's a long way to go in that respect.
Mark, I want to go back to the article. I know that within this article, not only you touch on the country of Spain, and also you brought up other significant nations as well. For example, Argentina. Now, and I want to go back to this, and I quote, this is something you wrote.
Yeah.
Argentina's National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons was established in 1983 after the conclusion of so-called Dirty War, a period during which state-sponsored death squad targeted anyone perceived as a threat to the regime. Now, what is the relevancy between Spain and Argentina within this article? So in other words, why is it also important for us to understand this historical facts or the historical unavoidable evidence from Argentina?
Well, I think this is really the point of the article. Comparing Spain to other countries is very illuminating in this respect. And Argentina, I'm glad you brought it up, is a good example of a country that tried to enact a combination of restorative justice and retributive justice. Just to briefly explain those two, restorative justice is more aimed at victims, in this case, victims of a dictatorial regime, or the families of victims, whereas retributive justice is more legal in nature. It largely consists of seeking and prosecuting war criminals. Argentina, interestingly, as you say, in the early 80s, did both of them, or tried to do both of those things. It set up a commission to investigate people who had simply disappeared, a lot of whom, of course, were murdered. So that was restorative justice, and it was fairly successful. It found that up to 30,000 people had disappeared. But it also prosecuted several of the generals who were found to have committed war crimes during the Dirty Wars. So this is important because no efforts like this, are perfect, and still what the Argentinian Truth Commission is still open to criticism, is criticised. But it was an attempt at holding people to account. Who had committed war crimes, and also seeking to identify and remember people who had disappeared. Now, in Spain, as I say, up until the early 2000s, neither of those things had been done. And it's important also to remember, in Spain now, there is still and there never has been any attempt at retributive justice, that is, seeking prosecution for people who committed war crimes on either side, on either left or right side during the Civil War. So again, I think Spain's making a good start with the update of the 2007 law and the latest update. But a lot of people in Spain still feel very angry and resentful that there's been no attempt to hold people to account for what they did during the dictatorship.
Mark, I know you're very busy. Now, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, when you mentioned regarding the phrase called war crimes, I think just to keep everyone in the loop and also more relevant today is the war in Ukraine. And of course, on one hand, everyone has been following what's happening not only to the people in Ukraine, but also the country of Ukraine. Again, the country is being devastated, because the war, and also because these innocent lives are, I guess, being lost on the daily basis. Now, some people also argue that because of the whole dictatorship of Vladimir Putin, that this war crimes, or he has become one of the war criminals, and for the future generations, and this is something that is unavoidable. So make it more relevant to what you mentioned regarding the history of the Spain. How do you think that people are going to judge the war in Ukraine at this moment, or even for the future reference? Do you think that's still important for us to understand that the crucial or the indispensable part of the war, and also its negative impact, not only for the country, but mainly for the people? How would you explain that?
Well, it's always difficult to sort of say now how future governments or future countries will judge the actions now of particular governments. But I mean, yes. I mean, obviously, Vladimir Putin is breaking all sorts of conventions and rules here. I mean, one hopes obviously that he is held to account. One hopes obviously that sometimes that there are people within his own administration who sort of have the guts to step in and try and stop what's happening. But Putin is essentially an autocrat. Putin he's in essence a dictator. He does what he wants. So of course, yeah, this is hugely damaging, not just for the people of Ukraine, but for the notions of democracy in general. And yes, one hopes that he is held to account for everything he's doing right now.
Well, Mark, I want to wrap up our conversation by going back to the article. Again, the title is rather interesting. Can truth ever bring reconciliation in Spain? Now, I want to direct the question to you. After everything that we've been talking about, do you think that today, that truth ever going to bring reconciliation in Spain? So in other words, when we look at what happened in the past, and when we look at the current political changes, and also we look at the people's desire, looking for this stable, or looking for this stability, socially speaking, politically speaking, do you think that truth today in Spain will ever bring reconciliation, and what will that look like?
Well, so you mentioned two quite separate things there. One is sort of getting at or establishing the truth, and the other is using that as a basis for reconciliation. And there are different kinds of ways of reconciling oneself with the past, of course. But I think the problem, the huge problem in Spain today, even 40 odd years on, is that the issues about the civil war and dictatorship are still at the heart of political divisions in Spain. And part of the problem is that you have one camp of people saying, well, this is the right way to go about this. And you have another camp of people saying, well, no, we disagree. This is the way to go about it. As long as that's the case, it's difficult to see how there will be a sort of cross-party collective consensus on what to do in concrete terms. Although, as I say, I think there are good things about this new law, and I think Spain is making a start on that process, but it's going to take a long time. In terms of truth, that's a rather different matter, because I think if you're talking about historical truth, that's not really something that it's up to governments to legislate about, which is where I was critical of the latest memory law, and indeed the 2007 version. I don't think it's up to governments to legislate about what happened. I think that's the job of historians and of educational establishments. And in that sense, the educational aspect of this new law is a huge step forward, because, as you say, first people need to learn as objectively as they can what actually happened. So yeah, it has to be a collective effort. I think as well, I should say that international historians, non-Spanish historians, and international bodies and charities have also contributed to this, and perhaps Spain needs some support from the international community as well, not just from its own governments. But it's looking better than it was 20 years ago, but there's a long way to go. Yes, I think, to answer your question, I think it is I think it is possible, but the examples of other countries I mentioned in the article show just how divisive and difficult reconciliation is.
And I believe I agree with you, Mark, because today, not only Spain, but for a lot more countries, they're also standing at the crossroads. And not only we're looking for ways to bring harmony and bring peace together, and also that really needs the effort, or what we call the accumulative effort, from every single country in order to see this common prosperity.
Yes.
Right.
Well, just one final point on that. Part of the problem in Spain is that a lot of people think, and again mainly on the right, but not just on the right, that all of this is simply unnecessary. And again, it goes back to the argument I mentioned earlier that Spain's democracy is itself a refutation of the past, and that we don't need, or rather Spain doesn't need, to engage in this complex process of reconciliation, because it's simply not necessary. Spain has already moved on. So that's, you've always got to bear that in mind, I think, when you're talking about reconciliation in Spain. A lot of people think it's already been achieved, really.
And which I think it's very enlightening for all of us to understand as well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Mark Nayler. And again, Mark Nayler is a freelance journalist based in Spain, and I strongly encourage everyone to go online, look for his work, and of course, one of his amazing articles, which is entitled "In Spain, Can Truth Ever Bring Reconciliation?" So Mark, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and again, we admire reporting all the way in Spain, and we wish the best to you and love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to the political changes in Spain. Thank you, brother, for doing this.